Everybody, welcome back or welcome to week 6/7 of MAPL 607 Grassroots Mobilization and Targeting. I'm Dave Ebner. I'm the instructor one of the instructors for this week. So, as I said, this is video 3 of 3 for the week. If you missed video 1 on the political science literature behind direct voter contact, or video 2 about working with volunteers. Those are available. I hope you enjoyed them. If this is the first one you watch, though, don't worry, you're not missing any. Like, you're missing something, but there's no timeline issues involved here. So feel free to watch this one first, and then you can go back and look at the other two. So what we'll focus on here is I just really want to give some, I guess maybe, so we talked, obviously, the first video is very, very tactical, right? Here's what to do, or here's how to go about direct voter contact, whether it's phone, stores, whatever. Video 2 is more about logistics, right? Personnel, how to recruit and manage the people you have on your campaign. And maybe this will be more of a strategic look at how we can use voter contact or mobilization to help not only obviously do the simple tasks of what we're trying to do, right? Persuade voters or mobilize voters, but how we can think about this in terms of our broader campaign and how we can kind of set ourselves up to be effective mobilizers once that day comes, right? So that's where I'll start. So GOTV, we think get out the vote, right? Typically happens within 4 days of real live voting, right? I mean, less and less, especially this year. We used to talk about like the final 4 days before election day, but there are so many different ways to vote in so many different states that we can think about this more as like, okay, within 4 days of being able to vote, whether that's mailing a vote in, going to early voting, or going to the polls on election day or whatever, right? But think about the GOTV is going to be not necessarily only effective, but most effective and kind of should be done within 4 days of votes taking place, right? We'll get there in number 3. Before that, before you get on your campaign, though, you often have months, if not weeks, or if not months, or potentially years to kind of prepare your district, right, or prepare your campaign to go out there and do that, right? But how do we get to that point? Before that, we have a period of persuasion, obviously, where we have an open window to convince supporters or convince potential voters one way or another to be our supporter. And we can think about that strategically too. But the first thing I want to talk about is what you can kind of do with supporters, right? And think about this broadly, right? So we kind of lump people into a variety of categories, right? And I didn't put the fourth category, which would be non-supporters up here, right? But we think of voters as falling into several different categories, right? They're strongly with you, and they're going to vote, right? You're not sure if they're with you, they're going to vote, but they're going to vote. That's a persuasion target. And you're sure they're with you, but you're not sure they're going to vote. That's a mobilization target. But what about the people, and especially in this time of high partisan polarization, we have really good data really on a lot of these people with the voter file, right? Maybe we know these people are not only strong supporters, but they're really likely to turn out to vote. I think sometimes this is an under-resourced or an opportunity that's not taken advantage of a lot of times. And maybe this is a situation where this early in your campaign, maybe before you even get to this persuasion task, or before you've identified who your persuasion targets are, perhaps. So like, for example, I worked on a congressional where we were supported by the DCCC, but we had to wait until, man, I don't know if it was like June or July or something to get the updated voter targeting information on the voter file with all of their, I'm like drawing a blank on the scores, right? Their persuasion scores, their propensity scores. Sorry, that's what the term I'm looking for. So before we got all that modeled stuff from the DCCC, we had just the regular voter file and information from past campaigns that we could use, but we weren't sure if these were true persuasion targets yet. So I got started in April. So in between April and June or so, we didn't want to do a lot of untargeted persuasion, obviously, right? That waste time and resources that actually could potentially hurt you, depending on who you're calling that early in a campaign, right? So, and maybe this isn't necessarily time sensitive, but this would be, maybe if you had limited resources, you wouldn't be spending a ton of time with these supporters and stuff 4 days before election day. You have other priorities, right? But farther out, or maybe if you have a lot of resources, or maybe particularized resources that would be effective at talking to members of your base. So maybe I'll describe that. So think about this as the base. Maybe. What can you do with your base in order to drive direct or to set yourself up for a good grassroots mobilization campaign? So what you can do here is call into this list or contact this list. Maybe you wouldn't want to go door to door, but use your callers to talk to this list to develop volunteers. So you can double check and kind of like double check, call it, check in with your supporters. But what you can do here is call through these types of people and ask them to be volunteers for the campaign, or maybe potential donors if they're unwilling to spend time, but maybe have a little bit of extra money. So this is one of the ways in which you can think of the base as also an opportunity for not only, maybe not true mobilization or persuasion, but how you can use direct voter contact or use your resources to call them. So you can call into your base, ask them to volunteer, recruit them, but also kind of remind them that there's an election going on, right? So you can kind of use supporters and use your base to kind of start to kind of calibrate your sites and to calibrate your messaging, right? So in talking to supporters is another good way to test messages or to test that kind of thing, right? Where you talk to people you know are supportive and talk to them about the issues and that kind of thing. So in practice, you'll do a little bit less of this, and maybe this is kind of like a third order thing, but I don't want to discount it. And it's something that I had a lot of success and I know was really effective for some of the campaigns I worked on, is especially when I had callers that just needed a list to call and I didn't have a list available, or it wasn't time for persuasion or time for mobilization, but I had a lot of people and resources available. You can call to your baseline list or contact your base and ask them to be volunteers or just kind of engage them in the campaign in other ways. So that's more of a little secondary thing, but it will make a difference. And if you have the resources, don't let it go to waste, right? Just because they're your supporters and they're voters doesn't mean there's no reason to get a hold of them, or there's nothing there to be gained, right? More importantly, in practice, when we're thinking about persuasion, we're thinking about the time period, maybe a month or the few weeks or so in advance before voting happens. And what you want to do with these kind of targets is well, I think it kind of goes back to kind of this, but I'll bring a broader kind of point here. Is whenever you're talking to a supporter, whenever you're talking to a potential persuasion target or a potential mobilization target, maybe this is the most important part of this lecture, or this video, is track the information. So the worst thing that you can possibly do for yourself, but also for that person whose time that you just ask them to volunteer, is to kind of have their efforts go in vain. And when that happens is when you don't keep track of and database and operationalize that data you acquire. So before I go even farther and apply this to here, and here, whenever you talk to voters or talk to whether they're supporters or not, you need to be tracking that information. So that's why we have walk sheets. That's why we have the apps and everything. But collecting information is what you're doing out there. And maybe that's where I should have started, right? Because even when you're calling into your perceived base, or what you hope will be your base, there's a lot of information to be gained there, whether it's, like I said, asking them to volunteer, the issues that they bring up, or the concerns that they have with your campaign. So even if they go like, oh yeah, I'm definitely voting for your person, I'm definitely voting for so-and-so, but have you heard about X, or what are you doing about Y, or have you heard opponents doing Z, what are you doing about that, right? Having those conversations is important. It engages them in the campaign, but also you want to keep track of that information. So this is also applying to maybe the video on working with volunteers. The most important thing you can do here is to make it easy for them, but also you need to do the follow-up of tracking that data when they go out there and collect it. So you put that volunteer ask on the call sheet with a checkbox, right? That's another thing here. If you want your volunteers to collect this information, write it down, right? Make it part of the routine, make it part of the materials that they have, and train them on how to do that, how to fill out their tick sheets or their walk sheets correctly, or to do it correctly in the app, right? When you're talking to your supporters in your base, that's the most important. You need to keep track of that information. So using NGP van, right? Tracking your contacts there and having effective notes, especially from supporters or potential volunteers. So this goes back to the training principle too, video two, working with your volunteers, but also working with your staff. Remind them that a conversation is useless unless you track that information, especially because if you identify strong supporters, you want to move them to a different list or take them off the list. When you're out there doing persuasion, you need to record the answers that they give you, right? Because you either need to know that they're still undecided, or know that you need to go back, or know that you don't need to go back, or maybe shouldn't go back if the person's particularly hostile or something like that, right? And this will connect back to those first two videos about what makes this stuff effective, right? Tracking that data, but also that volunteer and staff experience. If you're continually sending back people to places you've already knocked, the voter is going to get a little frustrated, but that volunteer is going to have a bad experience as well and think you don't know what you're doing. So track your list, keep that information, and update your list so that the next time you print out a list, it's all updated, right? So say a volunteer goes out, knocks on no, maybe not 100, knocks on 50 doors, right? They have 15 conversations. They've identified 7 supporters. They've identified 2 non-supporters, and 7 or 8 people are still on the fence, right? Next time you develop this walk list, right, you're going to cut those non-supporters out. You're going to update your sheet so that and you're going to cut your supporters out next time you go persuasion, right? And now you're going to have a targeted list that's much more effective, right? You've gotten out your supporters, you've gotten out your non-supporters, you're going back to just your persuasion target. So in persuasion, in here, you're developing information. You're getting intelligence, right? And you're processing that and you're putting that back into your system. And then next time you develop a list, next time you pull a list or create a walk sheet, it's going to be a much better list. It's going to be a much more precise walk sheet. You're going to be much more efficient next time you send out a volunteer or have your staff call or knock this list, right? So the most practical and the biggest tip here is that what the point of all this is to get information about people. But if you're not tracking that information, or you're not translating that information into actionable intelligence, then you wasted everybody's time, you wasted a bunch of money, and you wasted a lot of opportunities. So when you're calling into your supporters or calling into what you think is your base or into strong areas of support, you kind of want to develop maybe a different script. So you'd say, and maybe you'd be a little assumptive in your language when you call these people. You'd say like, hey, I know we can count on you for support of our candidate, but I was calling to check in and see if you'd be willing to volunteer or something like that. Maybe be a little bit more assumptive and a bit more leading in your language and let them cut you off, right? Because you want to go in here assuming it's like, hey, based on my information, so-and-so, you seem like a strong supporter of Democrats or Republicans or whatever. Can we count on your vote this year? And they'll say like, yeah, probably, yeah, because hopefully most of them will say yes. Hopefully at least 90 to 95% will say yes. Otherwise, you're in a bit of trouble, and maybe that would be something you would learn from this, right? Calling this list that you think is going to be your base, if it turns out to not be your base, maybe you need to recalibrate your targets, right? And that's another thing that collecting this information is going to do, right? It's not just going to make that next walk list better. It's going to make your strategic plan for when, where, and how to target voters much better because your information is going to be much better, right? You need to keep this information, you need to collect information and track that and reincorporate into your system, however that's going to be done, right? Vote Builder kind of does this pretty automatically, especially with the walk list on your phone, right? That stuff's getting constantly updated. But also if you're adding in layers about volunteering, adding stuff about specific issues or stuff like that, right? Another really effective thing to do here for persuasion, and maybe this sounds so kind of like basic, but honestly, not every campaign does it. What you can do here is, depending on who your targets are, you want to have a bit of a different script or a different message to do persuasion, right? So, for example, if you're going to an older community, you want to have your script be about Social Security, Medicare, right? If you're going to a college area, you might want to have it be about, either job creation, student loan forgiveness, or medical marijuana, or legalizing marijuana, or something like that, right? Stuff that younger people care about. It's going to be more persuasive, but also the more kind of, I don't know, the more persuasive, but the more targeted your message is, the more information you're getting based on the reaction of that voter, right? So if you go to a college student and you're talking to them exactly about things that you think they should care about, that your campaign's strong on, and you're still not getting through, that's going to give you information and give you, kind of inform your strategy for what you're doing going forward. I'm starting to go a little bit long, but this stuff is honestly really interesting, right? The strategic idea of how we use direct voter contact to drive the campaign is an integral part of the campaign. So strategy wise, right? Fine to call into your base, to talk to your base, and when you do, make sure to be a little bit assumptive, draw them along, but try to get more than a vote out of these people, right? And the other thing I'll say here is that, yeah, most people are going to say no, but having been asked will make them feel a stronger connection, or at least feel like this campaign's more important, right? If you need help, that means, man, the least they can do is give you your vote. They're more likely to give you that vote if you ask them for something stronger, right? You can start high, right? Donor, volunteer, canvasser, and maybe they'll settle for giving you a vote, which you'll happily take. Persuasion wise, like I said here, strategically you want to do persuasion not just to persuade people, but to build your kind of like to narrow down your list, to make them more effective, but also to inform your messages and your targeting, right? So if you think that you're going to do well with middle class voters, you send your canvassers out there, you're not going to know whether that was a good idea unless you track and keep that information and feed it back into your system, right? So that's another way to think about this strategically, is that direct voter contact is an iterative process. You should have more than one contact with a lot of these voters, especially if they're persuasion or strong mobilization targets. You're going to have more than one piece of contact with them throughout the campaign. You don't want to knock on the same door 3 times in one day. Tracking this information and using it effectively will allow you to kind of spread out those targets and do this systematically, instead of kind of flying by your gut or going by the reports of a couple canvassers or volunteers. If you really treat this information seriously and train your canvassers to treat it seriously, you'll be able to use it to improve your campaign kind of exponentially, right? Every shift that you send out should improve your next list even more, right? And this still build on each other. And the more canvassers you send out, the more targeted you get, the more effective your campaign will be. The more closely you can narrow down your persuasion targets, identify them, put them into boxes, the faster you can ask your supporters to volunteer, to make a donation to your campaign. And then third, this is all kind of going to be the same for mobilization. It's all going to be very similar, but one way I like to think about this, and one way you can remind your staff and canvassers that all this stuff in the first 2 stages, especially this big stage here, is really important for this stage here, right? The only way that you can do this well is if you do these first stages well. If you do your modeling and targeting, and then you do your persuasion and you track that information well. Because what are you doing in persuasion really? You're identifying mobilization targets. That is the goal of persuasion. More often than you're actually changing minds when you're out here doing these calls or canvasses, you're identifying supporters and identifying non-supporters. And if you track and keep this information well, when you go to do mobilization, you'll only be knocking on the doors of the people who you know are supporting you, and you won't be knocking on the doors of the people who said they're supporting your opponent. If you do these first 2 stages well, your mobilization is going to be incredibly targeted and incredibly effective. If you don't do these first 2 stages well, then mobilization ceases to be this form of targeted, direct kind of strategic effort and starts to be, this more tactical effort on the ground, right? And starts to be this more indirect blasting out of messages, knocking on 100 doors and hoping 55 of them are your guys and 45 are the other guys. you do this persuasion well, persuasion, actually changing hearts and minds, difficult but possible. That's the goal here. That's why we're doing it. But really, the more practically important thing of what you're doing when you're doing this stuff is acquiring information, updating your list, and improving your mobilization campaign. Because this, in a lot of situations, is what it's going to come down to for you, especially in a close election. And if you're knocking on your supporters' doors and getting them out there to vote, it's not going to help you. However, if you did persuasion well, if you talk to your base, if you know your context, if you know your supporters from your non-supporters, this voter mobilization thing is going to be the thing that helps you win. It's going to make sure that your performance is way better than your opponent's, right? If your performance is better, your share is going to be better. Sorry. This way of when you increase performance, then you're also going to increase your share. The things go hand in hand, but you can't do one without the other. And from a practical point of view, driving home the idea of that the point is data collection and then following through on that and your role in the campaign, right? Incorporating that data back into your targeting and developing your list better is going to be the key to making this thing work, right? And strategically, I would think about it this way, right? You don't know who to mobilize if you don't do these first two stages well. And the only way you do those first two stages well is by making it a priority, training your canvassers and volunteers and staff well on how to do it. And then as a campaign, taking seriously the role of data collection, data entry, and reincorporation into your whether they're vote builder models or whether you're doing this, with your own software or whatever. But if you go out there and collect a bunch of information and never use it, what was the point in the first place? Yeah, those people will maybe be more likely to vote and remember your campaign, but you'll maybe waste your time by knocking on their door again or not knocking on their door again if you don't collect and track and save and incorporate that data well. So this is all kind of a piece of one thing, and what the parts start to fall apart, right? Or the whole thing starts to fall apart if one part falls apart, right? If you haven't identified good targets for mobilization, your mobilization is going to suck. If you haven't identified who your persuasion targets are, you're going to spend a lot of time in this stage talking to non-supporter, never supporters, and always supporters, right? So you want to keep this in mind when you're doing. So it's like the goal is collecting information much as it is actually doing the persuasion or here, right, or actually recruiting the volunteers or whatever. You're collecting information so that your voter mobilization campaign can be targeted and effective. So I think I'll kind of wrap up there. I talk forever about this kind of stuff, right? Especially specific instances or maybe some anecdotes or what you do here or there. So I'm happy to take questions or maybe respond to some discussion posts. But this is how I'm thinking about direct voter contact in practice. Some tips for doing so effectively. Make sure to go back and watch that video too about working with volunteers too. That incorporates a lot of this stuff, right? So and how they work together. So thanks for joining me. I hope that was helpful, interesting. And that will be video 3 for this week. So thank you for joining me this week, and I'll talk to you all again. Thanks.